Hey everyone, welcome to the session. This is the first session on what's in stock, which means it's a brand new series where I'll be going through some stock motions and trying to thematically cover the ideas behind them and what are the most common arguments that are run in these motions. That we'll be focusing on a very small aspect, in this case, monopolies, and trying to see what is the best way to then go ahead and approach these debates. I heavily encourage participation because if you don't participate, there's not going to be a lot to learn. Uh, just very quickly, I can you see my screen?
Yeah, we can see.
Great. Ground rules before I go ahead and begin. The first one is always take notes. If you're not taking notes, then you're not really learning. Don't just sit there and just assume with the stuff. Second, always ask questions. If you're not able to actually tailor the questions and not ask specific questions, that means you're just agreeing with everything I'm saying, which is again not the best way of learning. You want to get feedback specific to the problems you're facing in these kinds of rounds. Third, always fill feedback. I will be submitting a feedback form at the end of the session. This will help me iterate and improve on this, especially since this is a new series. Lastly, and a brand new ground rule, there's a limit to stock, which means you can't just memorize the arguments that are going to be presented within this session and think of them as gospel. You still have to, one, either show creativity and try to change these arguments to suit the motion, or even if you don't go ahead and do that, at least if everyone is running the same arguments in every single debate, no debate will actually be interesting or winning. So, therefore, if you want to get better, you do have to iterate on top of this, introduce your own knowledge, and keep getting better. We look at this through examples as well. Cool. With this, I'll dive straight into the first motion. The way I'm going to structure this is we're going to discuss one motion, try to think of themes and commonalities that are representative of monopolies within that specific motion, and then try to apply them to the next one after discussing that common ground. Also, I forgot to make slides, so you'll see me making them real time. Have fun. Cool. The first one is this house would break up tech companies. Fairly simple motion, but I do want you guys to think about this. Let's try to come up with the stakeholders first. So, what do you guys think will be the common stakeholders? Take 15 seconds to think about it. You can reply on the chat or unmute. Cool. Consumers is one, MSMEs or medium to small companies. What else? Shareholders, economy, employees, consumers. Excellent. Anything else? Cool. Yeah, I think we covered the massive gist of it. One thing I really like is you talk about employees as well. I think there are a couple more stakeholders, but I won't reveal them now. I wanted you guys to think deeper about it. Can someone give me an argument against monopoly? Why are monopolies bad? Concentration of power. Can you elaborate? Why is that necessarily a bad thing? It'd be really nice if people could unmute and give ideas too. That's how you'll get better. Cool. Yeah, I see a couple of things. So one is lack of competition in terms of lack of options for consumers. I think this is a really good argument, specifically when it comes to monopolies. But let's try to explain it deeper. Why do you think that a lack of competition means bad options for customers, or why is lack of options necessarily a bad thing? Yeah, go ahead, Anish.
Lack of competition also means that there isn't any check on the free hand of the market, so that this particular company can just charge for whatever the products that they give. So they're essentially a price setter.
Correct, makes sense because there is no competition, there is no one to undercut them on prices, and whatever prices they give, everyone else has to agree to it. What else? How does this like impact consumers in terms of lack of options? Let's think deeper about this. Very similarly, why do we think monarchies are bad or in general dictatorships are bad? The dictator could be a great person. Even if they have all the power, they could necessarily be a benevolent person and therefore be an excellent ruler. Why do we still not allow dictatorships?
Because there is a risk that they might be bad.
Absolutely. So, one, there is the possibility that they will be bad. That's excellent. How can we prove that this possibility has a massive chance? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think the problem is when there are multiple companies, when there is a bad product, the company can come to know it's a bad product because people don't buy it. But when you're the only option, that bad product is the only option, then people would likely buy that thing. So you don't know what is wrong, what is right.
Excellent. Yes. There's no incentive to go ahead and get better, the point at which there is no competition, because people have to buy your services or people have to buy your goods because they have no alternative to those goods. Their alternative is not like benefiting at all. So they're likely to buy yours. We get an excellent idea in the chat as well. There's no regulation or accountability. Normally, in the free market, how accountability works is like Sharik mentioned, you stop buying the products you buy from a competitor. In this case, however, since in monopolies you have no options except the limited few, there's no incentive to go ahead and innovate, which means you either raise the prices because you have like nobody has an option, or you don't create better products and you sell them low quality products. But also there are constant incentives to make more money, right? Because if you're a business, obviously your primary target for your shareholders, one of the stakeholders we did, or people at the top, is to generate more profit and more money so that they can go ahead and boost their salaries. The only way to do this then is to not then like have innovation, because you don't need innovation and that will require research and development, which is expensive. Instead, you will not waste that money, you will not make a better product, you will just keep selling your product. So there's an incentive to keep your product not like at the level that it is and not innovate, while there is no incentive to go ahead and then innovate. All of this means the lack of competition necessarily results in you going ahead and not creating better things for people. Cool. What else is there? Kanishka has an excellent argument in the chat. Employees suffer. Why is this the case? Anish?
Because you're the only company, it also means that you're the sole provider in the private market space, which means that employee regulations and contractions cannot happen because otherwise people don't have a job.
Excellent. The same argument we talked about in terms of consumers, in terms of you having no alternatives, you cannot jump ship to another company because there are very few companies because they hold a monopoly, means that it will be very difficult. We'll get into the regulatory ideas also later, but employees suffer because they have no alternatives if you want to keep working in the same field. So, for example, if I want to work in like big tech, I only have 4 or 5 options that dominate the market. All other options necessarily don't have the money that they can pay me. What is another way in which we can think about this? How else can people who are looking for a job in this sector suffering? No trade unions is also an impact of this. Let's jump into that first. Cool. What happens if a important sector is dominated by a couple of companies? How do they interact with the state? If these companies are monopolies and they have a lot of money and power, how do they necessarily exercise that power? Yep. So one thing in the chat is they could easily lobby, and that is one of the things that happen, right? We see this actively happening in status quo, where a lot of the big companies lobby for certain kind of changes that they want. These changes are incredibly harmful to other people. One thing we talked about is in terms of worker regulations and worker rights, where they go ahead and negotiate in a manner with the government that they lobby the government in a manner that in the future all laws that are passed are anti-labor or anti-union, and therefore it's very difficult for you to go ahead and create leverage for yourself to get better working opportunities in terms of pay or in terms of like creating better working hours or a better work-life balance. All of these become much worse, which ties into our idea of laborers. What else? How do these people lobby the government? Think what happens when you dominate a sector. What
Your existence is essential. So if you stop producing the product, then basically something crumbles.
Sure, but why is that a harm on monopolies?
Oh, that's not a harm on monopolies. It's the power of monopolies. I didn't understand your question.
Yeah, no, actually, I think that is a harm on monopolies, and you could have, we can expand that to much better. But true, that's also in terms of people are so reliant on you, they have to listen to you. That is a way in which we can prove why government lobbying is successful by these people. But okay, if I am heavily reliant on Amazon, let's say, and Amazon supply chains break down, what happens?
The people of the country suffer because their packages aren't being delivered. Accessibility becomes less.
Exactly. And that's a massive problem, right? Especially in monopolies in debates about utilities. So, for example, water or electricity, if you like, these are monopolized by certain people, and suddenly their grid shuts down for some unforeseeable reason. Everyone in that area loses electricity. Nobody has basic access to functioning things. This could happen with water, for example. In the California fires, we saw that 70 or 80% of the water is controlled by one family, which means because of their monopoly, if they are not interested in giving water, California does not have enough water to go ahead and douse out the fires. We see these kinds of examples in real life where there's an increased dependency on them. And if anything goes wrong, that means the people are left suffering. That's also an excellent argument against monopolies. What else? We talked about innovation, right? So, who innovates normally? What do you think of when you think of innovation?
When you're trying to get better than the competition
Yes,
to
but
like appease the consumers.
newcomers. Can you elaborate more? What kind of newcomers?
Like the people who want to enter into the market for innovation, like if there is monopolies, only certain kind of people are dominating. And if some person wants to make startup or do something, that does not happen because people are buying the product of that monopolies only.
Mm-hmm. Yep, excellent. So startups particularly are hurt because they cannot become successful in this landscape. Why is this true? Why are startups not be able to be successful? Barrier of entry. What does that mean? Why is there a high barrier of entry? Go ahead, Anish.
Because you're a monopoly and you have a lot of lobbying power, you probably can lobby for certain rights that make you give you very inexplicable benefits while making the entire market very disadvantageous for other vendor.
Excellent. Exactly. Yeah, Ritika.
Also, if any newcomer wants to make startup or do startup, then the person needs to keep the price at least to the whatever the input is there, whatever the price of input is there. So if any new person wants to enter into the market, and monopolies are already at that certain price to which they can the new startup cannot do that. That's why it it can't suffer money loss in the beginning, and that's why a lack of entry is there.
Excellent. Yep. I think we covered most of the big arguments here. One, in terms of how, because of lobbying power, you necessarily get a lot of favor from the government, which could, one, make it really difficult or expensive for you to enter this particular market, or two, even if you enter this market, these big brands are able to shut you down completely. How? So one thing is in terms of preferential contracts. What this looks like is, for example, the government usually pays contractors in order to build a new project. If you hold a monopoly and you're lobbying the government, you can tell the government, like, you will get most of the good high paying contracts. It's very difficult for other companies to become profitable since you are getting all the nice contracts. Sharik?
Yeah, I think the big reason why it's harder for entry is simply because they have economies of scale, which means they can always give lower prices because they have much more resources and better production systems. But smaller companies will always have to charge higher prices because they need to break even.
Excellent. Yes, I think this complements Ritika's point very well. Ritika, do you have anything to add, or is your hand raised from last time? Cool. I'll assume nothing to add. Right. I think this is what becomes extremely important, right? The way you become successful as a startup is to be profitable, because there are two ways necessarily. You either have access to a massive market share, or you have highly profitable business. It's incredibly difficult to get a massive market share since these monopolies already have that massive market share. And these customers, because they're loyal to their existing brands, or because of the inertia of switching to another brand is high, you necessarily stick with your existing brand unless there's a massive reason to do so, which means people don't go ahead and then create a profit share, create a market share when they're entering a new place which is already saturated with monopolies. That's idea number one. Idea number two is you can generate a profitable business. One of the ways to capture market share is by making your product cheaper than the rest. So even if you like my product more, if the other product is substantially cheaper and almost at the same quality, you will still go for that because people care more about money than they do about other things. But like Sharik mentioned, economies of scale means that these people can have much cheaper like products than anyone trying to enter the market for the first time, because they don't have existing supply chains, because they don't have the same labor force, because they don't have access to the same materials, etc., etc. We'll talk more about this later. Necessarily, what this means is you can never have cheaper prices than your competitors necessarily in this space when you're starting out. All of this means that you're doomed to fail right from the beginning against monopolies, because you will either be shut down by them lowering their prices, or the fact that the lobbying works against you and you're not able to turn in a profit. Any questions till now? Cool. I think we've been able to come up with excellent arguments against this thing, monopolies. Let's try to summarize them. Who was actually taking notes? Does someone want to tell me? You'll have to unmute. I cannot see the chat. Come on. These are the broad four things we talked about: how there is a lack of competition, which leads to one, price gouging, because now you can sell much more expensive stuff. Two, lesser innovation in terms of you having no incentive to create better products. Three, political lobbying in terms of how you'll be able to go ahead and then give, like, use your power in order to manipulate the government into doing what you want. Fourth, we talked about in terms of lesser benefits for employees. These are the broad arguments against monopolies. Cool. What are the arguments for monopolies? Why are monopolies a good idea? Yeah, Anish.
Yeah, I just wanted to have a clarification. When we're talking about four monopolies, um, do we necessarily try to differentiate between government monopolies and private monopolies when we are talking four monopolies?
Sure, they have their layer of differences, but let's assume private monopolies right now.
Can lower costs be an argument? Like we discussed that monopolies usually have lower costs and
Hmm.
hence like newer companies can't really compete. So if there is a monopoly, consumers get lower costs because of existing supply chains and factories, etc.
Excellent. Yes, something we talked about in terms of economies of scale becomes really important here because they can have lower costs. Can someone explain to me how economies of scale work? Why are economies of scale more successful?
Because you can make like if even if you're making like say 10 cents on one product you sell, if you sell a lot of product, you still have a chunk of profit. So if you sell more, you have more total profit. I don't know if it's right.
Yep, excellent. In terms of how you can have lower margins because you're able to sell in high quantities, which means your overall profit will be still high, even if the money you make on like one product or one service might not necessarily be that high, which means you can make cheaper products. Excellent. What else?
Just for the sake of this argument, isn't this directly clashing with the price gouging of monopolies IRL?
Yep. That's how debates work. Both teams will have to argue in terms of what's more likely to happen. Is price gouging more likely to happen, or economies of scale more likely to happen? What else? I mentioned a very specific word about why economies of scale are helpful. We talked about this in terms of Amazon and what happens if they fail. Why would they fail?
Yeah, existing supply chains.
Yes, supply chains. What this particularly means is suppose you are like Amazon is selling a product, it needs to get from like other sellers, right? It's redistributing. How do you get product from sellers? You need trucks. So if you already have 5 trucks, for example, that are already running it on the ground and you already have drivers hired, it's very easy for you to make the next delivery. Someone trying to come enter the market will have to buy these trucks, find drivers, hire them, establish routes, get all these deliveries happening, etc., etc. Because Amazon has already done all of that legwork, they have incredibly good supply chains, and they don't have to depend on making them from scratch. When you're starting out a business, this means your costs are lower because every single delivery is now cheaper to do because you don't have to spend as much money because you've been doing it before. What else? Why is like so, in terms of economies of scale, we talked about how you can sell things for cheaper. Is it also true you can buy things for cheaper?
Yeah, I think the supply of raw materials is particularly cheaper because they have more bargaining power. As in, like if you're buying in bulk, so you're able to like get it at lower prices.
Excellent. Yeah, one is in terms of like buying things wholesale, like raw materials, etc. So for the automotive industry, you obviously need a lot of steel and aluminum. To get all of these things, you then buy in them in bulk, which means you drastically reduce prices. A smaller company will have to buy the same steel for a higher rate because they're not able to buy for the same amount. That's number one. Number two, we talked about in terms of political lobbying, it could be helpful in these cases as well because you have state backing. Maybe they support you and give you more grants, or they give you more like tax cuts for these kinds of things, which necessarily means buying these things or the costs you generate for these kinds of things is much cheaper. The influence you have because of your standing with the government could help you in economic deals. Maybe they can introduce you to new suppliers and you both agree on cheaper prices for one another. All of this means economies of scale work because you have better supply chains. You can tolerate lower, say, like lower margins, which means you can sell for lower, but you also buy goods much cheaper. All of these prove our existing argument in terms of economies of scale and why they're successful. Yes, Anish.
Given that private monopolies are profit maximizing in nature, could you just tell me one incentive a monopoly has to keep things cheaper and not just price gouge the entire way through.
Right. So the way this necessarily works is that you still have one checks and balances from the government in terms of antitrust, which means even if you're a monopoly, it's not like you can massively expand and completely exert your influence. Two, you still want to go ahead and sell to a massive amount of consumers, right? To tomorrow, if like the iPhone goes ahead and doubles its price, people can realize, oh, I don't really need an iPhone. So even though iPhone has a sort of monopoly on the market, people will still realize that alternatives exist. Just because we say that a company has monopoly and it's difficult in terms of barriers of entry, it doesn't mean no other place exists or no other alternatives exist. One idea there. Second idea, monopolies don't exist in a vacuum, which is to say it's very rare, except for the state, that a singular like company dominates the entire markets. We mostly look at duopolies or oligopolies in terms of three, four powerful players, and they're constantly fighting against each other as well. So there we have to talk about how this incentive to still go ahead and produce economies of scale. That even though it's more limited than a place where competition is 100% balanced, it still exists this incentive to go ahead and reduce. Does that answer your question?
Thanks perfectly.
Sure. Anything else? Any questions on economies of scale? Cool. We've proven the mechanisms behind economies of scale and why they're helpful. This also proves the impact in terms of cheaper goods. What is the final impact we can derive from this? Why are cheaper goods necessarily good?
Because not everyone can afford expensive goods. Consumers get the product for a cheaper price.
Mm-hmm. Yep, definitely. Cool. What is another good thing about monopolies?
I think investors need to like have a huge trust to give a lot of capital. And when
Mm-hmm.
you're a big company and when you're a monopoly, investors have like much more confidence, so they invest more, and this results in more money for R&D and innovation.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. High capital in terms of investor confidence. Excellent argument, right? The thing is, investors, and especially in this case, tech firms, so VCs, necessarily want to side with the market leader and invest in you in terms of your future growth and potential. If you're a monopoly, your potential is already maximized in terms of you will be the market leader even 10 years down the line, and therefore it's a good idea to go ahead and invest in you. You're a safe bet. On a comparative, if the market is ever changing and it is equally balanced, tomorrow there might exist a new competitor that will overtake you, reducing investor confidence, reducing the number of money amount of money you're able to put into this, which means tech firms now are able to generate much more investment in money than they necessarily would be able to otherwise. What are the benefits of this? One, we talked about R&D. Why is R&D important?
To further lower the costs for a company, like if you watch the company's incentives.
Sure, but what other like benefits are there? Try to think of the other stakeholders, right? Who's the most important stakeholder in this debate? Is it the companies or
Consumers. Consumers.
consumers? So how would
Better
they be
quality
better?
of product.
Sorry, let's go one by one. Pratham, how would consumers be helped out?
Yeah, I want to say consumers, but I do have a doubt about it, so I'll speak later.
Sure, Anish.
I think in mostly developing countries, monopolies do a net good because of the fact that you are bringing in the primary amount of R&D, which helps the people, especially from a very underdeveloped stage. In the
But what exactly is R&D? Why is it beneficial? Ria?
I mean, A, in terms of better quality of product, but also I think can it also be applied to getting grants and like IPs, which you can then sell probably.
Sure. Again, let's focus on our main stakeholder being consumers. Grants and IPs, it could also be portrayed as a bad thing in terms of IP restricting your ability to replicate stuff. I won't go there. Anish?
I think it just makes the product more accessible because you have now made a better and cheaper product.
Mhm. Excellent. There are two good ideas. One from Ria in terms of how necessary research and development is necessary for innovation in order to go ahead and access better quality of goods and services, which means a lot of the top tech companies invest so much money into R&D because they know in order to create the next big feature or the next premium thing which will generate them profit, they have to invest money in research. This is why we see so much funding going into AI right now, because people believe that can change the way that, like, change at least their economic prospects, because people want to go ahead and use AI. This was only possible because we spent so much time researching it. Chris.
One argument we run
Uh, Chris, I'm going to
to
block
do
you.
validation.
You're, Chris, I'm muting you. That's because your voice is breaking too much. Maybe do it on the chat. I'll respond to you immediately. Yeah, the second idea was Anish's idea in terms of accessibility. And this is incredibly important, right? Because note, when a monopoly has 80 or 90% of the market share, the only way it can expand to a bigger market is by targeting people who do not have access to a lot of goods and services, because these people are less likely to buy your items. Necessarily, then, the way you do this is by making it more accessible to them or making it specifically for them, because they are relatively untapped markets. But for that, you need a lot of research and development into what people these are, market research, what kind of problems they're going through, so product research, and then how can we generate a solution or a tech product that necessarily fixes their issues. So, for example, things like accessibility features on your phone, in terms of how even blind people can use phone very well these days because the features they developed. That's only possible if you have a lot of money and you have a lot of capital to spend in terms of R&D. Yes, Anish.
Does this also imply, with a monopoly's ability to venture out into untapped markets, that a particular monopoly in a society can also become cancerous, where it goes and also tries to dominate other markets?
This can be argued both ways, right? I'd argue accessing untapped markets is excellent because of your ability that these people now get benefits and goods that they never have access to. Which means if tomorrow we can create a really accessible phone to people who don't have necessarily access to phones, their lives get infinitely better. So it is possible that they're able to tap into other markets, and maybe they tap in a manner that's incredibly bad, but they survive because of their money. But it's also possible that in terms of accessibility, they're able to provide a lot of benefit to people who didn't have a chance to get this benefit before. It can be argued both ways. Does that answer your question? Um, Yeah, enhanced and regulated customer service on the end of the company, because they need to maintain the trust among consumers. That's an excellent idea. I'll come to that very soon. There's a much larger idea behind that. Uh, Product diversification also looks better in monopolizing, for the simple reason that they have a set of capital to invest into the research required. Yeah, pretty much what we've already talked about. Once you have a lot of money, you can use that money in a more positive manner to go ahead and maximize your own profits, which could also end up helping the people. Pratham?
Yeah, I think the problem that I'm not able to understand is that opposition will just come and tell me why will a monopoly have incentive? And I get that you're saying incentive is tapping into untapped markets and getting profit from there. But why will the company just not sell like more expensive product to people who can afford it and still like earn a lot of profit? Like I'm still not able to understand how strong is that incentive.
Yeah, this is very similar to the argument Anish asked about in terms of incentives for monopolies to behave well. Again, monopolies don't exist in a vacuum. There are still antitrust regulations that are necessarily put against them, so they can't abuse their position. Two, monopolies don't exist as the only people in the market. Sure, they have a dominant market share, but you still have one other startups competing, which means you always still have alternatives. And if you get really bad, they will go ahead and opt into these alternatives, or you exist in duopolies and oligopolies in which there are multiple competitors. So in the phone market, you have Samsung, you have iPhone. So you still have strong competitors, even if you have a high market share. And it's not like you can get away with anything you want. Does that answer your question?
Not completely, because in the example that we are taking of a monopoly, there isn't a Samsung or Apple. There is just Apple, right? And that is the monopoly. So there is not necessarily any competition that I probably will see coming from a startup because they have high barrier to entry and things like that that we discussed.
All right. So over here we're talking about big tech companies. So it really depends how you define big tech. But if you're defining it in terms of social media, I can argue there are multiple in terms of Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat. Although all of those are owned by Meta now that I talk about it. Uh, but necessarily, what this means is that there are still other companies trying to compete and who offer some sort of alternatives. Just because you're a monopoly right now doesn't mean you'll always stay a monopoly. You are constantly looking behind your back because if you slip up, people are very fickle and they're ready to change at any point of time. And especially if you do something bad, they will hunt for alternatives at the quickest pace possible. So these debates exist within a sliding scale, which is to say it's not like these companies will behave 100% properly because they are so scared of losing out on their market share. But at the same time, it's also the fact that it's not going to be like they can dominate the market and do whatever they want and they're going to break all rules, because we have safeguards against that existing in terms of antitrust policies and whatnot. That is one. Two, there's still economic incentives to get better, right? In terms of expanding your market share more. You are a greedy company and you're always looking to maximize profit. If you saturated the market, what do you do now? You still have to find new ways other than just increasing your prices in order to convince other people to buy because they have limited capital. It's sometimes more easier to tap into an untapped market than it is to simply increase your prices.
Yep, that answers my question.
Sure. I understand this is really difficult, and this is one of the hardest things that necessarily happens in an economics or in a monopoly debate. You just have to prove that it is somewhere of a compromise where, sure, you have to give up some of the harms that come with monopolies, but you also talk about necessarily how they have incentives to behave because of the threat of other oncoming competitors. Anish.
Are all the necessary benefits of monopoly, such as R&D and I think getting into untapped markets and their benefits, exclusively on the reason why they have a lot of capital per se?
Yeah, pretty much. The thing is, accessibility and R&D require a high amount of capital in order to like originate. It's just that in if you don't have a lot of capital in one company, it'll be very difficult for you to go ahead and conduct these things successfully. So they never try to do it in the first place. It's only when you're comfortable and safe that you do this. So, for example, when big tech was having layoffs a couple of years, the first divisions to cut were R&D always, because what is the point of innovating for the future if you're trying to save money right now? So therefore it's only achievable when you have spare income. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, but I just have a follow up to that. I think if
Mhm.
opposition just comes up and says that we'll have other alternatives to generate same sort of capital per se, let us say government initiatives or let's say other sort of branching startups, whatever it is, how do you necessarily respond to that? How do you make high capital an exclusive reason in monopolies?
I mean, one, in terms of government initiatives, where do governments do these kinds of things? Like, it's governments have a lot of places they want to spend money on. Why they will spend on R&D for big tech is something that's left incredibly questionable. But two, even if that's true, they have limited capacity and it's inexclusive to both sides. Which is to say, you can have government funding, government R&D, and your R&D. Which is to say, like, what is the problem over here? You can necessarily have both benefits at the same time. It's not like you only need to have one. So you're able to scale the impact better than the other side. Does that answer your question? Any follow ups?
No, no, thanks.
Cool. Let's keep moving forward. What else is there in terms of why these like e- monopolies might be good? Okay, so what happens when you're a monopoly? You're the biggest face in the market, right? When anyone thinks of, say, search, online search, they think of Google. Why is this specifically important? Why is this massive image incredibly important or beneficial? The reason for this is accountability, which is to say, it's much easier to hold one specific party accountable than it is to hold five or seven different parties accountable, even if they have power. So, for example, think of media, right? When you go like media accountability or social media, when people want to generate backlash, you want to generate, suppose you want to go ahead and then protest against something, it's very easy to call out one specific company, highlight their bad actions, and then generate awareness of this, than asking seven different companies to stop their malicious practices. Because if they're abusing the same rule or they're all doing something bad, it's very difficult for you to go ahead and call out all seven at the same times. Or for example, if you want to ask people to stop buying products so it impacts their bottom line, it's very easy to do it and you say stop Google search. But if you say stop going ahead and engaging with the entire market, the entire domain, which is made up of multiple different companies, this becomes much harder to do. Yes, Anish.
I'm sorry for asking so many questions, but
No,
like,
no, that's the point. Go ahead.
uh, can you make this argument that it is a prerequisite that a monopoly provides something of an essential service in order for it to become a monopoly in the first place? Which kind of, and how would you respond, like for example, big tech, where smartphones are extremely essential in today's world, and how would you respond to like boycotting said monopoly products?
Yeah, the point is, like, even though they are essential, you still can generate measures against them that go ahead and make them feel like they need to behave. Which is to say, sure, I'm not saying smartphones will die out or they will completely not have any income, but if you impact the revenue streams enough, that these profit hungry companies, which are highly dependent on investor confidence, suddenly see a 10% dip in their revenue, they will do anything to go ahead and then fix that, because that 10% revenue is much more important to them than it is to go ahead and like bully their competitors, for example, if that's what you're calling them out on. So I am not saying, again, it exists within a sliding scale, but if you can generate enough of a difference, it is still going to impact them. These people also, because they're monopolies, care highly about because their brands care highly about their image. The way you go, like the way Apple sells itself, is you're owning royalty that this is the premium brand. If you go ahead and then shatter that image, it's really difficult for them to run marketing campaigns or brand names, which means people can still go ahead and go to Samsung and buy their phones because they don't believe in the main selling point of Apple anymore, which means you're still able to hurt them significantly enough that it somewhat impacts their bottom line and they might not run out of business, but it is more profitable for them to fix their issues than stay with a destroyed image. Does that answer your question?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks.
Sure. Any other questions, sir? Mm-hmm. Yes, Pratham.
Yeah, I have a bit of unclarity in terms of what we are talking about. At like, are we talking about a monopoly existing in a vacuum that there is no competition, or are there other big monopolies?
Yeah, so it really depends on the motion, but it is fair to say no monopoly ever exists in a vacuum. That's just physically not possible. Then you have garbage antitrust clause. Necessarily, then, in this case, in terms of big tech, is why I keep mentioning Apple and Samsung and all of these things, because necessarily they exist in a duopoly state. But even in other motions, you probably will have competitors. It's almost impossible to have a monopoly.
Okay.
Sure. I get it. The whole session's name Monopolies, and you guys are really focusing on that. But it's more about big players who dominate market share and not the only existing player in that big player in that sector. Any other questions? Cool. Let's circle back to the idea, right? Because the point is, if there is something problematic happening within that sector. So, for example, it was data breaches with the tech sector, right? It's difficult for you to hold seven different companies accountable, both from a person perspective, but more importantly, from a governmental perspective. Because if you're creating, for example, court cases after seven different companies, chasing and investigating all of them at the same time, the amount of resources you have to expel is massive, and it's really difficult for you to do that. If it's only one company, then it's much more easier to go ahead and bring cases up against them or try to enforce regulation on them, because you only have to enforce them in one place. Necessarily, this means you're able to exercise your laws much better against these. And this serves as a comparative to the idea of lobbying. That sure, these companies might be able to lobby, but in the laws that we do have, which are much harder to, which cannot be replaced by lobbying, that ensure checks and balances, necessarily these companies have to obey them more than anyone else. because everyone is going to go after them and them alone because they are such a big player in the market. Therefore, it's very difficult, and because these massive brands hold their image very important, much more than a random startup would, necessarily they have to go ahead and show that they are accountable. Otherwise, people are less likely to buy their products. Any questions till now? Cool. This was the first motion. Yeah, Anish.
I just had one last question. I think a lot of debaters in motions such as these, especially in let's say proposition, won't run the this motion essentially becomes an aspect of whether or not these big tech companies will become monopolies or not. So like proposition talks about how they will become monopolies, opposition talks about how they won't become monopolies per se, then directly going ahead and defending the aspects of monopolies per se. What would you suggest? Like intuitively speaking, I think every single like most, let's say, people would be against monopolies intuitively speaking. So like do you just tackle them head on and say that yeah sure these will be monopolies and we'll tackle them, or like these won't be monopolies in that route?
Yeah, so strategically it differs debate by debate. Sometimes it's an excellent idea at closing, for example, to be like, sure, we're happy with monopolies, we'll take that burden in this debate. So it can be really smart to do there. If you think it's easier to prove that there won't be monopolies, go for that. But sometimes strategically it might be better to go ahead and bite the bullet. It really depends on the motion, really depends on the room. My like what I'm trying to do here is like give you the weapons in terms of having to debate both sides. You have enough argumentation. So if you feel you have to defend a monopoly, you can absolutely do that. So like one of my losses in round five in Nalsar was that I could have just simply defended monopolies and gotten an easy first in that round. But because I was too tentative or hesitant to go ahead and defend monopolies, I just lost the debate because I couldn't think of ideas about why monopolies are good. That's what I'm trying to do in this workshop.
Yeah, yeah. Got it. Thanks a lot.
Cool. Let's keep moving forward. I want to quickly summarize. We have been able to come up with arguments from both sides of the house. We've been able to come up with a bunch of stakeholders. These look like innovation. This looks like the overall economy. This looks like employees, consumers, all of these things. These are the broad three, four arguments that apply to every single monopoly debate, both for and against monopolies. I'll just quickly go over them again and we'll apply them to different debate motions. Arguments against monopolies. Uh, One about what is happening. Yes, one about how there's no competition, which leads to price gouging, lesser innovation, how they can politically lobby and get benefits in their favor, about how there's lesser benefits for employees because they're going to be paid less, how it's difficult for startups and competitors to emerge in these market sectors. In terms of benefits for monopolies, one about how you're able to generate economies of scale, how this necessarily means your products are cheaper, how there's high capital in terms of investor confidence, which leads to R&D, which leads to accessibility, all of which means innovative products that are able to help people on the ground much better, or cheaper products that they can go ahead and access. And this also means there's greater accountability because all of the laws are designed to go ahead and protect against you, and you're the one forced to be accountable because you value your brand image. Cool. Let's go to the next motion. The next,
Hello.
yeah,
Am I clearly audible now?
yes, Chris.
Okay. Before moving forward, just one last question. Is it intuitive to run that despite monopolies in the existing status quo, given the globalized world that we have, having a sole monopoly does not really exist, and rather close competitors exist, and nevertheless, so does thus strong call out mechanism and alternatives also exist. So
Yeah,
monopoly as a whole in a globalized world does not really exist. Can
yeah.
we run that?
Absolutely, excellent argument. This is something we talked about, right? Monopolies don't really exist in real life. The problem being that we have strong antitrust laws. But this is another excellent argumentation in terms of how especially since most of our stuff is digital or technical, it's easy to distribute around the world. What this particularly looks like is you have competition from abroad. So in terms of social media, you now have competition from TikTok, which is a non-American brand, and this is a massive threat to the American social media companies. All of this particularly means you now have to be forced to be like, people have much more options they can access, not just within your country but even outside your country. This means that you have to go ahead and this gives another reason as to why you can't form cartels, or you can't go ahead and just raise your prices like crazy, because there is some sort of competition always existing or threatening you. Yeah, Priyansh.
Hi, I joined late, so I don't know if this has been already covered, but I had just two ideas. Can it arguments against the motion can we run like probably like the economies of scale can happen? So if so, this is a direct rebuttal to
I'm
economies of
gonna
scale.
pause you. We've already done that. Anything
All
else?
right, all right. Yeah, yes, sorted, sorted. Second, I wanted to ask that can we run at against the motion that we cannot probably go ahead and hold regulate cannot regulate these companies because these companies when if there are four to five even if there are three to five companies they're probably going to collude together to probably set the prices high and probably they will not go it down probably.
Yeah, definitely. I think that falls into the idea of how there's a lack of competition and price gouging, about how these companies can collaborate together. It can obviously be argued, you can obviously rebut that in a debate, but yeah, that's definitely one of the points.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you.
Cool. Next debate. This house prefers a world where the publishing industry did not form conglomerates. So, just to give you some context, there are like five publishing houses in the world right now that are really popular. Penguin being one of the most like recognizable ones, and they have sort of created a monopoly on the entire market. They have so how necessarily now think of all the arguments we talked about before and try to apply them within this context. I'm going to give you 20 more seconds. I'm expecting someone to unmute or type in the chat.
Yeah, I have two arguments for
Mm-hmm.
media conglomerates. So against the motion.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, in terms of the
Wait,
economies
for
of
or
scale.
against the motion?
Okay, we're doing four.
uh, let's do government side first. Yes.
Okay.
One idea we have in the chat, lack of accessibility, entry barrier for newer authors. Why is that the case? Would anyone like to? This is an excellent argument, but why is this true? Why can't big publishing houses give access to newer authors? Their profit incentives. Maybe that author becomes very successful. Think of the idea of image and brand we talked about, and why is it so important while trying to select new authors?
I think there will be lesser creative freedom in terms of the brand probably will choose certain specific type of authors, and so there will be lesser like wide array of authors that will not get the entry. But if there are
Excellent.
different publishing houses, so there's more creativity.
Excellent. Chris?
um Apart from creativity, one thing can also be that say it's a transition phase, and if the publishing house is conservative in nature, it would not necessarily allow new budding ideas or ideas which are contrary to the ones that it has already established to come into the mainstream. That means you're eventually blocking the representation of diversities of ideas because you want to control the narrative, because that is one narrative that is going to profit to you. And if the other idea is going to unnerve the narrative that you have set, You lose the profit, you lose the people, and hence you lose your company as well.
Excellent. I think all of you present excellent points, right? And Chris, so like initially you talked about if these people are conservative, then this will happen. What you do well is then answer why these people are likely to be conservative. And these are ideas we get in the chat and from Ria as well. The reason they're conservative is they probably have a brand image and they want to portray themselves in alignment with the brand image. For example, if I know this publishing house has excellent fantasy magical books, then I will go and only buy fantasy magical books from that publishing house. If, for example, I see pick up a book from them that turns out to be a failure, then I'm not likely to go to them again because that publishing house reminds me of disappointment I had while reading a book. Which means one, they're not likely to opt into newer authors because they don't want to take the risk on newer authors because they want all of their books to look good because they have a brand image to maintain. But two, they probably have a very specific niche that they already operate in and they don't want to innovate outside of that niche, which means you won't want to submit a book in a different genre, or you necessarily don't want to, you want to have that very specific script and narrating style. And if you have a different storytelling side sign, you probably won't get published with that publish house necessarily. If they were not conglomerates, people in smaller markets are more likely to take these risks because they're like, hey, what if this one hits big and we don't have that much of a brand image to maintain? Whereas big companies and publishing houses are never going to go ahead and take that risk. Necessarily, this means newer authors are going to lose out in the market. Excellent argument. What else? Why else should they not form conglomerates?
Yeah, this is very similar to Chris's idea, which is the role of media is to present a diverse range of opinions. And when there is one kind of brand image that is there, it is harmful to that idea of what media is supposed to be doing. And so it's bad for public in general.
Mm-hmm. Sure, sure. What else? What are
Can we
the
also
go on, go on.
say that authors themselves are also more likely to be very confined within their writing spaces? So because these authors probably have to sell books or have to appeal to these publishing houses, that's why they also become very conservative or very narrow based on their approaches. So even they don't have an incentive to probably innovate in their ideas and stuff.
Excellent, excellent. I'm going to offer a small listing there. I think you just need to be comparative on this argument because authors tend to stick in a niche anyway because they know they'll be success. The next book has to be similar in order to be successful, or at least that's what they believe. So on a comparative, you will have to prove why they're willing to still be a bit more riskier. But I absolutely agree with the idea. You're forced to write in especially newer authors are forced to write in a manner that appeases the publishing houses as opposed to exercising their own creativity. Necessarily, this means all books that come out are of a certain type or of a certain existing genre, which means you lose out on a lot of creativity that necessarily exists in literature today. Yes, there's an excellent point in the chart as well because these conglomerates want to have massive, massive profits and they can't exist on small hit books. Necessarily, they will want to appeal to the masses and create something that's very generic in order to appease the most amount of people. You see the same problem with pop music, for example. Most of the publishing houses necessarily go for the same signature or the same like type of like music or books that already exist because they know it will appeal to the masses and not have to figure out too much in terms of what is creative, what is trendy, etc. What else? What stakeholders did we talk about when we were talking about this? What were the arguments against monopolies? Does anyone remember what are the arguments we had against
Yeah.
monopolies?
No competition, price gouging, lesser innovation, political lobbying, and lesser benefits for employees.
Sure, we've talked about lesser benefit of employees in terms of authors. I don't think political lobbying really applies over here. Maybe you can run an angle. What's left? Innovation is also something we've already talked about in terms of creativity. What's remaining?
Price gouging, but I don't know how to link it.
Uh, I think it's pretty intuitive, right? If you have multiple publishing houses, there's a reason to make your books cheaper. You want them to come and go ahead and buy your books as opposed to other books. But if there are a very limited amount of competition that you necessarily have, you can then price gouge and sell your books for more expensive because you know if anyone wants to go ahead and read books, they still have to come over here. So the whole books, like for everyone, get lesser accessible and become more and more expensive.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense.
Sure. This also comes in terms of negotiating power against authors, something we've already talked about in terms of unions. The amount of money the publisher charges is usually a percentage of the sales. So the amount percentage you negotiate against author now also becomes much more bigger because they have no alternatives. Um, Priyansh on the chat is like, probably like these conglomerates will rush in book releases, hence it can lead to lower editorial standards. But I don't know whether this is comparative or not. Yep, exactly. You have to prove to me incentives in cases of when there's no conglomerates. You still want to rush your book because you want to be first to market. What is the incentive for you to go ahead and then behave or try to go ahead and slow down your process? You will need this argument could potentially be done, but needs to be a lot more aggressively explained. Could there be an argument that this is worse for readers? Yeah, we talked about this in terms of how the quality of literature goes down because everyone sticks to the same niche, and necessarily this means you don't have a lot of quantity or creativity, and how this impacts readers in terms of them not enjoying the books or them learning lesser from the books, them losing the habit of reading, etc., etc. There's also an idea on how this affects free speech or those kinds of things, how political ideas are shut down because they're controversial, and publishing houses don't want to run controversial stuff, which necessarily means you don't get newer ideas or like slightly complicated ideas. Absolutely there. I think we covered a lot of stuff. We did cover all of the main arguments. Let's talk about why it's a good thing, why these conglomerates are necessarily good. Who wants to go first?
First, I think in terms of that, they can reach out to broader consumer base because they probably can sell like cheaper books. So I think whatever perspectives they are selling, they're able to sell it to more readers.
Why can they sell cheaper books?
Um, because again, like the supply chains and the cost that they have to incur while making the books is probably less.
Economies of scale, yes,
Yeah.
excellent. Let's try to frame this better. Why are economies of scale and cheap books so important?
Because book is not something that it's not a need, it's a want. Like you want to read books, it's not something that's not something that helps you to survive. So it's a thing of luxury. So people probably don't want to spend a lot on it, and for them to be incentivized to pick this book up, it needs to come at like a reasonable cost.
Excellent. What else? Think about a book, right? Like, why is it difficult to get a book into your hands?
You have to do a lot of effort, like you have to get out, I don't know, like comfort to get to a bookstore and get it probably.
No, in terms of why is it difficult to produce these books?
Because they can't, they have to source paper and wood, and like based on all the sourcing, since they are mass, like they're buying it on mass, they can do it for cheaper. That argument.
Yeah, excellent, right? The idea is it's really expensive to be a publishing house. One, in terms of paying the writers, the editors, marketing these books, actually printing these books, getting them to stores, getting them delivered, all of these things. Necessarily, the costs operated for a book, which tends to be very cheap. Like obviously, some books are more expensive, but in general, books are relatively cheap. Is which means the margins on these are extremely low, and the expenses are incredibly high in terms of creating a book. All of this is like the way the current publishing industries work. Most books actually run on a loss, which is to say you lose money on most of the books you publish. Only once you have a bestseller, you are actually able to go ahead and then become profitable. So you take the risk on 50 books to hope one of them becomes successful, and you live off the profits of that because the rest 49 are going to lose you money. Necessarily, that means that when you are a publishing industry, you do want to go ahead and minimize these costs in order to stay afloat. Necessarily, then, this is also why you have to, like, 100% of the time, you have to be able to produce a book. Otherwise, you will lose money. 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 Otherwise, you Hello, I'm back. Did the recording stop?
No, no, it's still going on.
I don't. Yeah, okay, it's still going on. Yes. What I was saying was, in order to stay afloat, you need to have economies of scale. That's the only way you'll be able to get books. In a comparative, when these conglomerates didn't exist, you would just not have books because it's not very profitable to go ahead and have these stores, which means lesser books and all the harms that we talked about on Gov side already. What is another benefit that could arise? Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Ria.
It's not a benefit, but I just want a clarification. So when we were doing government side, you said, like, people said that there's going to be limited perspectives because these publishing houses are likely to stick to one particular narrative or whatever. Can we just rebut this by saying that on either side of the house, book publishing houses are taking chances with books, right? That you just said, because out of 50, probably 40 books will eventually fail. So if they are any which ways taking bets, why are they not likely to take bets on authors who have newer ideas? Because like books are eventually anyway.
So, excellent, but you're trying to symmetricize this in your rebuttal. Why don't you flip it?
Flip it. Okay.
Anyone? Why do you think there will be more creativity in publishing houses?
I mean, can we just say that big publishing houses have the capacity to take risks?
Exactly, yes. Pratham?
Yeah, on the idea of it being on the R&D idea, they can go ahead and like fund things like investigative journalism, which is important in the world because they have a lot of money.
Excellent. Yes, they can absolutely increase their forms of media and you can invest into different kinds of media. But what else? Let's try to expand on Ria's idea over here about how they're willing to take more risks. A couple of questions here. What's the comparative?
Like smaller publishing houses already have a barrier to entry, so they cannot take risks. They have to maximize on every book that they sell. That's why they're more less likely to take risks, whereas big publishing houses always already have a established base.
Excellent, exactly. Which means not only that, two, you're also trying to find the next big thing, right? You're always trying to find the next genre, so you get a first mover advantage. You be associated with that next big genre. Necessarily, that means you go ahead and keep trying to experiment and trying to find the next hype, as opposed to just trying to go with the flow and what is popular right now. What else? What did we talk about? Why is a high amount of investment capital important? One was R&D. What was the second thing? Come on, we talked about this. Is nobody taking notes? Accessibility was the second important thing. How does accessibility play a role here?
Yeah, I think we already spoke about accessibility in
I
terms
think,
of why. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I have one idea on accessibility, probably like linguistic and cultural diversity. So,
Mhm.
for example, like a regional reader would like to read books in their language.
Excellent. When we talked about pro monopolies, we also talked about how necessarily we'd be tapping into newer markets in order to expand your market share. This looks like regional and cultural like expansion. This could be in terms of books in that particular culture or books about that particular culture. So these people find these books more relatable and are more likely to read them. All of these can only be achieved by a conglomerate. All of these are pro monopoly arguments. Cool. I'm going to move to the third motion because we are running very late. Uh, the third one is this house would break up energy conglomerates. Now, this is very similar on surface reading to this thing, tech. This house would break up tech companies, which is why I want you to think for a minute, think deeper about why necessarily energy conglomerates are different. Because note, most monopoly debates are not going to be different. What's going to be different is the domain they like separate into, and therefore, what is different about the energy domain than about the tech domain? Take a minute. Does anyone want to go? Type into the chat or unmute. Yeah, Priyansh.
So like just reading on energy conglomerate, I think they consist of companies that supply electricity or probably renewable energy. Probably like they harvest solar, wind, hydro, energy, like energies into electrical or any sort of stuff. Or probably they go ahead and probably extract oil, I think, and probably they can supply it to other industries, I think, and that is
Right.
what energy conglomerate means.
Yep. Let's pause over there. Energy is much more of a central need to most states and people than tech. And that is, which means people are highly dependent on energy more than they are on tech. Why is this a good thing? Like, why are energy conglomerates then a good thing if people are so dependent?
Can we say there are stricter regulations on energy conglomerates?
That's a debate, but no, that's not
Yeah,
what I.
because I think the argument on accessibility works here.
Yes, excellent. Arguments on accessibility work in terms of how they're able to provide energy to a larger source of people. What else?
Yeah, on that only on second on economies of scale, I think we can say that they can probably go ahead and build economies of scale and they can provide with cheaper products, I think.
Sure, sure.
They
Yeah,
can also they can also produce a large amount of these energies because they are an economy of scale.
yes,
And since
absolutely.
it's so essential, it's important. Yeah.
Absolutely. But I want to think of it in a reverse manner. If I am highly dependent on this, I can't lose it no matter what. Why are conglomerates important then?
Oh, so they can form global supply chain, and so if on the comparative side, since if we have different companies, so and if I'm dependent on one, and if any supply chain breaks down, I will not receive any energy, I think.
Excellent. Yes, in terms of how the risk of failure is much lower with these conglomerates because one, they have global supply chains, which means they can get their energy from somewhere else. Two, they have more established systems, which necessarily means they're less likely to break down. Three, they have massive investment capital, which means they can fix their issues much faster than another non conglomerate company could. All of these means even if I go without my need, I won't be going for without it for too long, and my dependence will be more likely catered to by these conglomerates than anything else. That is an idea. Why can this be a bad thing? Like, why are conglomerates bad if this is such a dependency? Fairly intuitive. We've already talked about this multiple times.
Yeah, you can't regulate them.
Yeah, price gouging, political lobbying, all of these get magnified by the point at which you are gone ahead and stuck with these monopolies, and you can't go ahead and opt out of them because they're a massive need. All of these harms also exacerbate at the same point of time. I think this was very intuitive. Cool. What else is different about energy conglomerates versus tech conglomerates?
Can we say the impact on environment probably is much worse if these conglomerates fail?
Yes, but can you talk about it in terms of our arguments about why is this a positive or negative thing? So, for example, who is more likely to invest in renewable energy?
Probably states or like large CEOs who wants to become philanthropic, like Elon Musk or so.
Who
Uh,
like care about their PR image.
Yeah. Excellent. Two ideas here. One, people with investment can who can spend money on R&D, right? Renewable energy is not that profitable as of now, which necessarily means you need to go ahead and invest a lot of money in order to make it either cheaper or like better in order to go ahead and sell more units of it. Necessarily, that means all of that R&D costs can only come from conglomerates. Second is the idea of how these people necessarily have a brand image to maintain, and therefore there will be people who are much more accountable in terms of corporate social responsibility, in terms of their media profiles. All of this necessarily means they want to act like good actors and therefore are going to invest in renewable energy. On the comparatives, startups that are struggling to survive just search for the most profitable immediate method because they don't have long term plans because they probably won't survive long term. Necessarily, it's much more difficult for them to then invest in green renewable energy. Excellent. What else? How is energy different from conglomerates?
They are they can be used in like to trade with other countries in like a lot more compared to say like a resource rich country like Saudi Arabia would probably a huge part of its GDP would be because of energy compared to
Um,
a
I mean, a huge part of GDP can also be because of tech. You are very close, but what is the point? I want you to think about where are tech companies most present?
in developed states.
In America, mostly, yeah, but in
Yeah,
developed states because they can headquarter, they can attract a lot of software engineers and workers and have them live in pleasant conditions. Where are energy conglomerates mostly based?
in energy rich areas in the world.
Energy rich areas. Where are energy rich areas?
They can be anywhere. They can be in Africa. They can be even in poorer countries
Yes, but usually why do they go to developing countries?
because cheap labor.
And
Uh, it's just easy to do business there because there is a
probably
lot of
of weak policies over there. I think
lack
they
of
can influence
regulation.
the government.
Excellent. And finally,
it
um,
is yeah, you can offer benefits to the government and it's easier to conduct business over
yeah,
there.
that's a lack of regulation. But the most important thing, where are resources available right now? Developing countries, right? Developed countries are massively use their existing resources, which means they have great demand for resources, which means either they've already used up all the resources in their countries, or the demand is so high and the supply barely matches the demand, and you can't dig more for other countries necessarily. Then developing countries are the most important because their resources haven't been tapped into, which means they're easier to exploit, but also just that they have an abundance of these resources, which is why you see a lot of like necessarily gold or silicon and all of these things necessarily coming from developing countries, not only because there's financial incentive in terms of cheaper and better, like more malleable government regulations, but also in terms of they tend to have the resources not being tapped into yet. All of this means that these companies mostly exist in developing countries. How does this impact the debate?
If you break up these conglomerates, it's usually worse for the developing countries who are profiting off of the production and the industrialization which is happening over there.
Correct, yes. But how are developing countries profiting?
They probably tax the amount, like they probably tax a lot and they'll have licenses to companies. They are earning a lot out of giving the resources.
Good, good. What else? Think about people on the ground, no?
So if we break up energy conglomerates, I think then the people or the labor at the developing countries can probably go ahead and they can ask for better prices because of competition, I think.
Yes, that's a good argument. We'll come to that. Pratham?
Yeah, the basic thing on labor is they employ a lot of people in these developing
Correct.
countries. And if you break them up, all these people lose their jobs.
Excellent, excellent. So the thing is, because they're conglomerates and they have a lot of money, they can establish massive bases, which non-conglomerates cannot do. They can maybe start small operations, but they cannot have high-scale operations. The benefit of high-scale operations is large amounts of employments, especially in developing countries where it's harder to find jobs, where the unemployment rates are high, and at the same time, government benefits of unemployment are low. You uniquely provide them the ability to go ahead and employ themselves, which means they have food on the table for tomorrow. All of this means people on the ground are necessarily benefiting. All of the taxation benefits and how this helps people on the ground also exist. So you are getting a lot of benefits in terms of employment. Tech companies don't generate this employment for people. Like they do, they outsource, but to limited degree. These manufacturing jobs, these primary or secondary level jobs are much more important to these people, and energy conglomerates provide these. Why can this be a bad thing? One, we talked about negotiating power in terms of what you can ask for as labors. What else? What did we talk about in terms of political lobbying?
That these companies have, obviously, they have the ability to lobby the government because the
And
government is
how,
now benefiting, profiting from them.
and how do they go ahead and then lobby? Like, what do they lobby for?
A minimum lower wage, or I don't know, like better licenses, because they can just pull out and then the country will be left with nothing. So they
Mm-hmm.
can probably reduce the prices or benefits.
Lower wage is definitely there. Better licenses, I'm not sure they already get the best licenses, I'm assuming. I don't know how comparative that is. But what else?
They cannot be regulated in terms of if they're mining oil, if they pollute a lot, they can't
Yes.
be stopped. You can't
Correct.
regulate.
Yes, regulations are the most important thing here. One, in terms of pollution, two, in terms of labor, which is why you see a lot of child labor in the chocolate industry or in the like cobalt mines. All of these places, because the fact they have limited regulations, or governments willfully turn a blind eye to all of the workplace harms that are necessarily going in there, it means that these people live under extremely cruel conditions where they have to go ahead and then sacrifice their bodies for an early death, or children, like young children, are forced to go into labor because they have no alternatives. Necessarily, then the harms that arise out of this are also massive. This wouldn't have happened in terms of if multiple conglomerates were there, where employment would still happen, but these harms wouldn't exist because it would still be marginally easier to regulate these kind of companies.